What's going on, y'all? Coach Jones here for another Lunch and Learn. We're talking about sleep hygiene, blue light, how that affects sleep, and how all this artificial light at night is going to impact our circadian rhythms and our hormones. Last time I discussed sleep in a Lunch and Learn, it was surrounded more so around ghrelin and leptin, those specific hormones. This time around, we're going to talk about cortisol and growth hormone. So this was a slide that I actually incorporated in the last presentation on sleep, and I wanted to implement it in this one as well, just to really bring home and reinforce how important it is for us to get good, deep, quality, restorative sleep. Obviously, sleep is when the majority of our recovery and our repair takes place, but we're also replenishing different types of chemicals. So you've got your neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin, but you've also got thyroid hormone, insulin, and interferon as well. Now, the purpose of discussing elevated cortisol. If you have not watched my video on sleep and the immune system, I talk in depth about cortisol and its involvement in the stress response. So if you haven't watched that video, definitely watch that, because all these lunch and learns tie together in regards to how stress impacts our hormones. But elevated levels of cortisol there's going to be some negative ramifications. So side effects, we're talking about cancer, obesity, heart disease. You can read the list. I don't want to read this for you, but I think a lot of people who know a little bit about cortisol really associate it with fat storage. So I think people will know, okay, that's my fat storing hormone, but it's not a bad guy. We need cortisol if there is any kind of trigger or stress response. And along those lines, if you see elevated blood sugar, that's because if you think about it, when there's a stress response, what's going to happen is the body will release cortisol. It's part of our ability to help fight off any kind of threatening type of situation. And it does that. And it does that to allow glucose to get to our muscles so that we can do what we got to do to get free and protect ourselves. But because that cortisol is being released, our insulin will be inhibited. So we're not going to, remember, insulin is going to be the hormone that's released to help us regulate our blood sugar. So our blood sugar will not be regulated if we're constantly stressed and those cortisol levels are high. So remember, whether it's an acute situation, running from a bear in the woods, versus just psychological chronic type of stress, same physiological responses are going to happen in the body. It is going to imbalance your hormones, and cortisol is released during a stress response, whether it's acute or chronic. And I want to read something to you. So stress is not a bad thing, but what should be happening is that we experience a stress response, and then at some point we recover, right? But if stress is chronic, or as we discussed, if our sleep is impaired, then it runs into a chronic stress type of situation. When it is chronic, it can result in a pathology to the endocrine system and the cortisol system. So in one of my previous videos, I mentioned the HPA axis. I highly recommend you look into that. That's the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and adrenal gland. And over time, a constant release of cortisol is going to turn into a good thing, where it's helping us address these stressors to more of a pathological type of impact. And that's where we talk about these different types of diseases like obesity or heart disease or cancers that can arise. And when it comes to fat storage, it's typically abdomen fat and belly fat. So keep that in mind as well. If you're under stress, you're not sleeping well, probably where a lot of that fat's going to accumulate is going to be in your belly. And then I want to go back to this. So that's a list of the side effects that can occur from elevated levels of cortisol. Some other things that can happen is that it can constrict our blood vessels, weaken our GI tract. It can suppress reproductive function, suppress immune function. It can obviously suppress our insulin. We talked about that. It can signal glucagon, which stores glucose in the liver, to release additional glucose into the bloodstream. So again, blood sugar not being regulated. And all these things are happening because the body's very smart. All these things are happening because it detects a threat. There's a trigger. So that's our way of fighting off some sort of a stressor. But these things become very problematic if it goes beyond a few seconds of us fighting for our life versus a chronic stress type of situation. In the morning, cortisol levels should be very high. That's what helps us get up and going in the morning. So with my health coaching clients, I always ask, because most people do have issues with sleep, how do you feel when you wake up? Do you feel recharged? Do you feel like you're ready and up and going? Or does it take you a while to get going? If it takes people a while to get going, it could be because cortisol levels are too low. Sometimes because of artificial light, our cortisol levels are spiking at night, but actually at night is when it should start to decrease to help you unwind and relax and help you go to sleep. So the cortisol levels should be high in the morning. They're going to continue to arise for about an hour after you get up. That's called the awakening response. And cortisol, if we think about the HPA axis, hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal gland is what's going to be responsible for releasing cortisol, and that helps you manage your body's daily rhythm, that circadian 24-hour daily rhythm. So cortisol is so important that it's going to impact all of these things on the bottom of your screen. Adequate levels of cortisol are going to impact fat, digestion, immunity, your blood sugar regulation, which we talked about, mental focus, things like hair, skin, and nails. Think about it. If our recovery is happening at night, we have to turn over and repair cells. That's how it's going to impact your skin, hair, and nails. Yeah, so cortisol is released from the adrenal gland, and it's a response to any kind of a stressor. That could be an environmental stressor, which we're going to get into in a second, psychological stressor, or a physical stressor. All stressors, different types, have the same response in regards to cortisol being released. Make sure I spoke on everything that I wanted to in this last slide. Yeah, the adrenal, right. So the adrenal glands, HPA axis, definitely look into the HPA axis. Now, what can elevate cortisol? A number of things. This presentation is about artificial light. We'll get to that, but we have to understand that other things can also increase cortisol release. Sugar, specifically fructose. So think high fructose corn syrup and how prevalent that is in a lot of processed types of foods. We talked about stress, emotional type of stress, pollutants. Let's talk about plastics. So if you saw my presentation on BPA and the second presentation that I did on the specific chemicals that are also in Teflon, remember, these chemicals are endocrine disruptors. They have an impact on our hormone response, and a lot of them also have negative ramifications in regards to our reproductive abilities as well. So we just talked about the HPA axis that correlates highly with our reproductive, with the release of specific hormones. And if we're constantly being bombarded with these toxic type of chemicals, potentially there's ramifications to our reproductive system. Different types of medications, insomnia, so not going to sleep, could mean that your cortisol levels are spiked at night, which is the opposite of the natural rhythm. Shift work, people who work swing shifts or overnight shifts usually have issues with cortisol balance and hormonal imbalances. So we'll talk about blue blockers at the end of the presentation, how you can attenuate some of that blue light if it's unavoidable. Noise pollution, if there's too much noise outside, that's going to obviously impact your sleep. And in regards to the HPA axis, since cortisol is released by the adrenal glands, there's definitely a connection to the HPA axis, and the HPA axis impacts sex hormones and thyroid function. So if you think about our sex hormones, I just want to go back to all these toxins that are in chemicals or things in our personal care products that we're ingesting or that's getting into our skin. Sometimes if we've got these imbalances of hormones, it could be specifically because of the different types of toxins that we're being subjected to, and that's throwing off our kind of natural dance that our hormones have with each other, where they're elevated when they're supposed to be and others are suppressed, and vice versa. So artificial light, there's different sources. I think most of us are pretty familiar with most of these. What might be a sleeper is fluorescent lights. I know the LED lights, people are more aware about how that type of artificial light exposure, especially at night when the sun goes down, can trick our bodies into thinking that it's sunlight. But fluorescent lights are also important, and a lot of gyms are using fluorescent lights. My naturopath back at home was telling me that any opportunity I have to work outside, she said, Kim, try to do your training outside so you can get out from under those fluorescent lights. So at Gold's Venice, back at home in Los Angeles, there's an outside area where you can lift. It's got dumbbells, it's got bars, it's got half racks, it's got turf, it's got a ton of stuff. I would do as much as my workout as possible outside and only went under those fluorescent lights when I needed to. So all of our digital devices are basically under this list. But sunlight, let's make a differentiation between artificial blue light versus natural blue light. So sunlight is important. It's a beneficial source of natural blue light, and it's beneficial to be exposed to blue light during the times of the day that we're exposed to the sun. So I'm indoors. There's no sun really in here. So I've got these on because I've got this artificial blue light that I'm trying to attenuate. And if I don't have these on, my eyes kind of feel like they're burning. So natural blue light from the sun, very valuable, very beneficial. Quick sidebar, melanopsin, my acupuncturist at home said, if you can get up and watch the sunrise every morning, then you're getting exposure to a hormone called melanopsin. And there's a lot of positive benefits from releasing that hormone that's triggered from this natural blue light. So make sure you research melanopsin. So when we get exposed to this natural blue light during the day, when we're exposed to the sun, it's very valuable. It makes it, this also makes it impossible to get improper blue light exposure from the sun, as blue light from the sun naturally signals correct circadian rhythms. So that's why sunlight is so important. We talked about hormone D in my previous presentations, but what's also important about sunlight is that you're getting that natural blue light, not the artificial stuff from our screens. So unfortunately, artificial light sources are going to make it possible to get blue light at any time of the day, not when it's naturally occurring, like when the sun's coming up, but any time. Specifically at night when our cortisol should be dropping and decreasing, but it's not because it's getting tricked by this artificial light. We're not biologically designed to handle this kind of effect that it has on our hormone levels and how it impacts our sleep quality. And these artificial lights trick our bodies into thinking it's daytime and suppress hormones that are needed for sleep. Blue light, great during the day and naturally from the sun, not so much at night when it's artificial. So other exposure. So we talked about the plastics and sugar, right? There's other ways that we can also increase the stress response in our body. And it all comes from synthetic chemicals, folks, that just are not natural and that our bodies should not be exposed to so frequently. So Frankenfood is going to have additives and different types of chemicals to make sure that food's taste and texture is palatable. A lot of toothpastes have toxic chemicals, mouthwashes as well, personal care products, shampoo, soap, lotion, makeup, perfume, you name it. Typically, it's got a lot of toxins in it. Go to Environmental Working Group is a good site to really test to see if you've got a clean product, because there's also buzzwords that sound like they're natural, but they're not. Think Dirty is a good app that you can use to scan things in the store. It'll do all the work for you and tell you if it's a good source of whatever you're using or if it's toxic. Different medicines and pharmaceuticals have synthetic chemicals in them. Cleaning chemicals typically have some harmful chemicals that create some endocrine disruption, and then plastics. So yes, blue light is going to impact their cortisol levels, but anything that's a stressor. So we talked about physical stress. We talked about psychological stress. Environmental stress is real as well. So 3 different types of stress, same physiological response in our body. So the chemicals in your products, what you cook with, what you wear, those are going to also impact your cortisol levels, because if they create a stress response, your cortisol is going to be elevated to respond. And if it's creating some sort of inflammation in the body, as long as there's high levels of inflammation, your cortisol is going to continue to spike to try to suppress that inflammation. So growth hormone, another important hormone, it regulates metabolism. So if you've got a disrupted circadian rhythm cycle through exposure of artificial light at night, at different times of the day where it's inappropriate, it's going to damage your metabolism. And that's been shown in various studies. So here's what's important about darkness and just being able to have that natural circadian rhythm where the cortisol's high in the morning and then the day gets darker and we're not as exposed to as much artificial light. Here's how this impacts our growth hormone. It peaks during dark hours. So if we're in a lot of light, we got a lot of LED lights in our house. We've got digital screens, smart TVs. We're just bombarded with this artificial light. That's going to impact the darkness that our body needs to actually release adequate amounts of growth hormone. We know how important sleep is for repair and recovery, but you need darkness for growth hormone to perform optimally. Good sleep is brought about through serotonin, stimulating the release of melatonin. Here's where things come full circle. One of my very first presentations was on the gut, and 3/4 of our neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine are produced in the gut. So yes, we're talking about cortisol and stress response, but what we eat and our balance of good and bad bugs, that ecology of bacteria in our gut is also impacting our ability to even produce enough serotonin, to even release the amount of melatonin that we need at night to get really good sleep. So yes, darkness is required for adequate release of growth hormone. That's also going to be contingent upon our ability to produce enough serotonin, because serotonin is what's responsible for releasing another hormone called melatonin, which helps with our sleep. And we can only get enough growth hormone to be released in the amount that it needs to be released if we're not in the presence of this blue and green artificial light. Blue and green light naturally from the sun, when the sun comes up, beautiful. If we could all somehow create a circadian rhythm, wake sleep cycle where we could get up with the sun, would be valuable. You would get that melanopsin release and you'd be able to get that natural blue-green light that our body needs to help with regulating our hormones. But we cannot get enough growth hormone if we've got all this artificial light at night. And there's different wavelengths. So right now I've got blue blockers on that have a yellowish tint. They're best for the day because they don't block out those beneficial blue and green lights. But at night, I have a pair of darker kind of orangish colored glasses, and that's blocking out that artificial blue-green light that we don't need, that isn't natural. So you want to block the blue and green light after dark. That's what's going to be imperative for really good sleep and then optimal growth hormone production. Not releasing enough growth hormone, it's going to impact your metabolism in a negative way. Releasing too much cortisol, that's going to impact your ability to regulate blood sugar. That's a perfect recipe for weight gain. It's a perfect recipe for having it be really tough to from a prevention standpoint, not experience any pre-diabetes or diagnosis of type 2 diabetes if we're not regulating our blood sugar. Okay, now here's a summary, because I want to make sure we're really understanding this concept about light, artificial light, and cortisol. So cortisol is going to rise in the presence of light. A lot of times when people get up in the morning, it's because the light's coming into their bedroom, which means at night you want to make sure that it's completely dark. So if it isn't, maybe a face covering to get that blackness is going to be valuable. Cortisol should be highest when you first get up in the beginning of the day. It should be lowest before bed. We are exposed to too much artificial light. We're going to jack our cortisol up at night, give us a second wind. It's going to be harder to go to sleep. And it's going to decrease our level of melatonin. So cortisol high, artificial light, growth hormone production lower and release lower, and then melatonin lower. Artificial light after dark is going to jack up our cortisol levels. If our cortisol levels continue to be high, it's going to contribute to elevated stress, which equals chronic stress. That chronic stress potentially can lead to anxiety or depression, or some of those other heart disease, obesity, cancer, or more serious types of chronic diseases. So when we get enough cortisol and we're up and ready to go in the morning, very beneficial. Not good at nighttime when we're supposed to be winding down and trying to go to sleep. Solutions. If you cannot escape from the blue light, got to think about ways to attenuate it. From what I've read, they don't completely block it, but they do attenuate it to the point where it's just not penetrating your eye and getting into your retina. And uh, macular degeneration is real as well. So there could be damage to your retina from too much exposure. So think about how many kids today are growing up looking at digital devices, iPads, and cell phones, and they're developing. So it's dangerous for everybody, but to a developing child, I would really look into and do research on different types of ways to attenuate that blue light. On my phone, I've got this hack where I have an iPhone. There's a color filter. I press my home button 3 times, it turns red. So if I don't have blue blockers and it's at night, I don't have this bright kind of spotlight looking at me as I'm looking at my phone. It's just a way to kind of attenuate some of that blue light by putting that red filter on. So that's a hack. Getting glasses is also an option as well. So the blue blockers can attenuate that blue and green artificial light right at night. It stops serotonin from so it'll help with the prevention of serotonin from creating that melatonin that's released from your pineal gland to help you get adequate sleep. If you want to regulate your sleep, you're going to have to be able to block this light somehow or another. And this has been the most efficient way for me to do it. And there's different companies right now: RA Optics, the letter R, the letter A Optics, Blue Blocks, spelled BLOX, Cyxus, CYXUS is another company. CYXUS is another company. Defender Shield is another company. Look them all up, see what's affordable. And remember, darker colors like the oranges and the reds are good at night. The lighter tints are good in the daytime because there's different spectrums of light you're trying to block out based on the time of day. And then obviously you want to wear your blue blockers that block that blue and some green after dark. That way you're not reducing your melatonin. It's not decreasing your sleep quality. It's not impairing your growth and repair. So that was a mouthful, but very important to know because we are so bombarded with artificial light. So I hope that I've given you some information that you can take and do some more exploration on your own. If sleep is a problem and has been a problem, first step, look at the night routine and look at once it gets dark, especially since it's summer, once it gets dark, do an inventory of where any kind of artificial light's coming from. Step 2, how can you attenuate it? And step 3, look for all the other types of stressors that are going to jack up your cortisol. So think about your environmental stressors. I cover those in some of my previous videos. Look at your psychological stressors. So being able to adequately implement self-care practices to lower your stress, that's going to decrease your cortisol. And so environmental stress, your physical stress, and there's another one that I'm missing, but essentially there's different types of stressors that all have the same impact. So being able to decrease those exposures will have a tremendous impact on your ability to balance your hormones. Thank you guys for joining me. It's been fun providing these videos. Looking forward to providing you with some more.